The silence in the great hall was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that pressed against the skin like ice water, the kind that made the air feel thinner, harder to breathe, as if the room itself was holding its breath waiting for something terrible to happen. Serafina stood at the center of it all, her hands clasped in front of her, her spine straight, her chin level, and she told herself that she was not afraid. She had grown up telling herself she was not afraid. She had become very good at it. The stone floor beneath her feet was so cold she could feel it through the thin leather of her boots, radiating upward through her ankles and into her calves. And she focused on that sensation, because it was real, because it was something she could name and measure and understand, unlike everything else happening in this room right now. "You are the healer," the voice said from the throne at the far end of the hall, and it was not a question. It was never a question when Caspian, Dravek, spoke. His words did not have the shape of inquiry. They had the shape of stone, of ice, of things already decided. She lifted her eyes and looked at him directly, which she had been told was something no one did. She had been told many things in the 2 days since her Matilda had signed the treaty, and she had been selected as part of the transition arrangement, a word that sounded almost dignified until you understood that it meant she was being handed over like furniture, like an item, of agreed value that would now belong to the Northern Kingdom rather than to the Voss Pack. She had been told not to look at the king directly. She had been told to keep her gaze at floor level. She had been told that the last person who had held eye contact with Caspian Dravek for more than 3 seconds had left the hall with a different understanding of their place in the world. She looked at him anyway, because Serafina Voss had a complicated relationship with being told what to do, and also because she was 24 years old, and she had spent enough of her life looking at floors. He was not what she had expected. She did not know exactly what she had expected. Perhaps something more visibly monstrous. Something that matched the name they called him in the outer territories. The beast of the frozen north. The Glacier King. The one who had not smiled in living memory, and had not bowed in longer than that. What she saw instead was a man who sat on a throne of carved black. Stone as if it had been built specifically around him, as if the throne was the accommodation, and he was the fixed point. He was large in the way that certain old trees were large, not ostentatious about it, simply present in a way that altered the space around him. His hair was dark, almost black, and his eyes, even from this distance, were the particular pale gray of sky, just before a heavy snowfall. He was watching her with an expression she could not read, which unsettled her more than hostility would have, because she was accustomed to reading people. It was one of the few things she was genuinely good at. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I am the healer." The court shifted around her. She could feel it without looking. The subtle collective adjustment of people recalibrating their expectations. She had spoken to the king without being addressed first, without the formal preamble, without the ritual deference. She heard someone to her left draw. A sharp breath. She did not look away from Caspian Dravek. He studied her for a long moment with those pale, storm-colored eyes, and then he said, "You were not what I requested." "No," she agreed. "I was not." He had requested a senior healer, someone with decades of experience, one of the old blood practitioners from the Voss Pack's inner circle. What he had received instead was Serafina, who was young and quiet, and had spent most of her life being underestimated by people who should have known better. The Voss Pack elders had made their calculations. A senior healer was too valuable to give away. A junior one, even a gifted one, was expendable. She understood their reasoning. She did not resent it exactly, but she filed it away in the same place she filed all the other evidence of how her pack had always viewed her, as an asset of middling worth, useful but not precious, capable but not irreplaceable. "What is your name?" Caspian Dravek said. "Serafina Voss." "Voss," he repeated, and something moved across his face. something too quick and controlled for her to catch. "You carry the family name." "I am the last of the direct line," she said. "The elders kept the name alive through me. It seemed important to them." "And to you?" She considered the question. No one had asked her that before. "I am still deciding," she said honestly. If this answer surprised him, he did not show it. He looked at her for another long moment, the kind of assessment that felt like being measured for something she did not yet understand, and then he made a small gesture with 2 fingers, and a woman appeared from the shadows to Serafina's right with the fluid, silent movement of someone who had spent years learning to materialize exactly when wanted and disappear when not. "Isolda will show you to your quarters," the king said. "You will begin your duties in the morning." He looked away then, directing his attention to the documents on the low table beside his throne, and Serafina understood she had been dismissed. She turned to follow the woman called Isolda, and she almost missed it, the sound so small it barely registered. But she had excellent hearing, and she was paying close attention to everything in this room. Just before she reached the door, she heard the king exhale. Not a sigh. Something different. The sound of a man releasing a breath he had been holding. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Isolda was beautiful in the way that certain weapons were beautiful, elegant and precise, and designed entirely for a specific purpose. She was perhaps 35 in apparent age, though Serafina knew from the way she moved and the depth behind her golden eyes that she was considerably older than that. She wore dark green and silver, the colors of the northern court, and her dark auburn hair was pinned back in a style that managed to be both severe and elegant simultaneously. She walked through the corridors of the keep with the confidence of someone who owned every stone she stepped on, and she spoke without turning her head to check if Serafina was keeping up. "The king's healers operate from the East Wing," Isolda said. "You will be under the supervision of Master Aldrin, who has served this court for 40 years. You will do nothing without his direction. You will speak to no one in this keep without appropriate cause. You will not wander." She paused at a junction of corridors and turned to look at Serafina for the first time since they had left the hall, and her golden eyes were cool and measuring and not particularly friendly. "The Northern Kingdom is not a place for the unprepared. I suggest you make yourself small and quiet and useful, and you may find your time here tolerable." "And if I do not make myself small and quiet?" Serafina asked. Isolda's expression did not change. "Then you will find your time here. Considerably less so." She turned and continued walking. "The king has more important matters than managing a Voss pack transfer. Do not give him reason to notice you." Serafina followed her through cold stone corridors, hung with tapestries that depicted battles she did not recognize, hunts across frozen landscapes, ceremonies under winter moons. The keep was massive, built on a scale that suggested its architects had been thinking about centuries rather than years. Everything about it spoke of permanence, of endurance, of something that intended to outlast every challenge ever brought against it. The windows were narrow and set deep into the walls, and through them she could see nothing but white, snow still falling outside in the late afternoon, softening the edges of the mountains visible in the distance until they looked like something from a dream. Her quarters were small, but not unkind. A narrow bed with heavy wool blankets, a washstand, a single window that looked out over the inner courtyard, a desk with a candle already lit. There was a small fireplace with a fire already burning, which surprised her. She had expected cold, had braced herself for it, had told herself she would not complain about cold because she did not have the standing to complain about anything here. She stood in the center of the small room after Isolda left and breathed in the smell of the place, stone and pine resin and wood smoke, and something else beneath it all, something mineral and clean, like water from very deep underground. She crossed to the window and looked out at the courtyard below. It was empty except for 2 guards standing at the far gate. and the snow fell on them and on the stones and on the fountain at the courtyard's center, which was frozen solid. Ice climbing the carved stone figures in shapes that looked almost deliberate, almost decorative, as if the cold had decided to be an artist. She pressed her palm flat against the glass and felt the cold radiate through. And she waited for the discomfort she had expected. The bone-deep chill that had always been her body's response to low temperatures. It did not come. The cold settled against her skin and she felt it clearly. She was not numb. She could feel every degree of it. But it did not hurt. It never had. She had never told anyone that. She had learned young that being different in ways you could not explain was something to keep quiet about, especially in a pack where quiet and small and useful were the categories available to her. She let her hand fall from the glass and turned back to the room. She needed to sleep. Tomorrow she would meet Master Aldrin and begin whatever form her usefulness would take here. She sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced her boots with careful, methodical fingers. And she did not let herself think too hard about the king's pale gray eyes, or the breath he had released as she was leaving, or the way the marks on her wrists, the faint silvery tracings that had been there since birth and that she had always hidden under long sleeves, had begun to warm the moment she entered the great hall. She did not let herself think about any of that. She was very good at not thinking about things. She lay down on the narrow bed and pulled the heavy blankets up and closed her eyes, and the snow kept falling outside, and the keep settled around her with the small sounds of old stone, and she slept. Master Aldrin was a compact, white-haired man of approximately 70, with the hands of someone 30 years younger and the eyes of someone who had seen everything worth seeing and had come to a measured peace with most of it. He looked at Seraphina across the workbench in the healing room on her first morning and said nothing for a long moment, taking in her youth, her travel-worn appearance, the herb satchel she carried over one shoulder, and then he said, "What do you know?" "Trauma medicine and wound closure," she said. "Infection treatment, fever, reduction, bone setting when the body is too exhausted to heal on its own, preparation of compound medicinals for chronic conditions, basic midwifery, though I have not been called to practice it often, identification of approximately 300 plant species and their applications, including 17 that are specific to northern climates." She paused. I learned quickly. He studied her for another moment. "Show me your hands." She held them out. He examined them without touching, looking at the calluses on her palms, the staining under her fingernails from years of working with plants, the steadiness with which she held them still under examination. His eyes moved to her wrists, and she felt, rather than saw, his gaze sharpened slightly on the edge of silver marking, visible below her cuff, and she pulled her sleeves down with a small, automatic motion that she had been performing since she was 7 years old. He did not comment on it. He said, "You will assist me until I can assess your actual capability. You will not attempt to treat any member of the royal guard or the inner court without my direction. The king's household has particular considerations." "What kind of considerations?" "Old blood," he said simply. "Ancient lichen. The physiology is not identical to younger wolves. Medicinals that work on standard pack members can react unpredictably in old blood systems. The king himself has not required a healer's attention in 60 years, but his guard is another matter, and they are all old blood. You will learn our protocols before you touch anyone." "Understood," she said. He nodded once, in the manner of a man who approved of brevity, and set her to work cataloging the existing medicinal stores. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that revealed whether someone was actually careful and thorough, or merely claimed to be. And Seraphina threw herself into it with the focus that had always been one of her more useful qualities. She cataloged for 6 hours straight, stopping only when Aldrin placed a cup of something hot and bitter at her elbow and told her to drink it, which she did without argument. By the end of the day, she had a complete picture of what the healing stores held and what they lacked, and she had begun a list in her head of substitutions and alternatives for the gaps. She did not see the king for 3 days. She heard him sometimes, his voice carrying through corridors when she was moving between the healing room and the storage chambers, deep and measured, never raised, but somehow always audible. The voice of someone who had learned centuries ago. That volume was unnecessary when authority was absolute. She heard others speak of him. Pieces of conversation caught at the edges of her awareness as she worked. The way the guards discussed the upcoming solstice ceremony with an undercurrent of tension she could not yet fully interpret. The way the servants moved more carefully when he was known to be passing. Through a given area of the keep, not fearfully exactly, but with a heightened attention. The way you moved near something old and powerful that you respected and did not wish to disturb unnecessarily. On the 4th day, she turned a corner in the east corridor and walked directly into him. She had not heard him coming, which was extraordinary given her senses, given that she could generally hear a mouse 3 rooms away if the walls were stone. She stopped with perhaps 12 inches between them and looked up, because he was considerably taller than her, and found those pale gray eyes looking down at her with an expression she still could not categorize. The cold that lived in the corridor intensified slightly, the way temperatures sometimes shifted near old-blood wolves when something disrupted their composure. "Healer," he said. "Your Majesty," she said, which was technically the correct form of address, the one she had been taught in the 2 days of hasty preparation before her. Transfer. He was looking at her with that same unreadable intensity from the great hall, and she felt something strange move under her skin. Not fear, not quite. Something more like recognition, like the feeling of remembering a word you had forgotten, hovering just at the edge of identification. The marks on her wrists were warm again. She pressed her right hand against her thigh and felt them pulse faintly, like a second heartbeat. "How do you find the northern keep?" he said. "Cold," she said, and then, because she was apparently constitutionally incapable of being appropriately diplomatic, she added, "Though it does not bother me as much as I expected." Something shifted in his eyes, not quite surprise. Something more like attention sharpening, the way a predator looks when something in its environment changes in a way that matters. "Most from the southern packs find the temperature difficult," he said. "I am aware," she said. "I do not." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he said, "Master Aldrin tells me you are competent. That is generous of him. It is not generosity. He does not use the word lightly." The pale eyes moved over her face with that measuring quality she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things that interested him, thoroughly, without apology. "He also tells me you identified a substitution in our Northern Meadow Suite compound that he had not considered, and that it is more effective than the formula we have used for 30 years. She had not known Aldrin had reported that. She felt something warm move through her chest at hearing it. The particular warmth of work recognized, which was a warmth she had not felt very often. "The northern species has a slightly different alkaloid profile than the southern variety," she said. "The adjustment compensates for it." "You noticed this in 4 days." "I notice things," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I know," and moved past her down the corridor, and she stood very still after he had gone, her hand pressed against her thigh where the marks on her wrist were pulsing steadily, and she breathed through the strangeness of the moment and told herself it meant nothing, and almost believed it. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. Isolda found her that evening in the courtyard. Serafina had developed the habit of taking the air for half an hour after the day's work ended, standing in the cold and breathing it in, which helped her think. The snow had stopped, and the sky above was extravagantly clear, thick with stars that looked closer here than they ever had in the south, as if the cold had polished the atmosphere to a higher clarity. She heard Isolda's footsteps behind her and did not turn around. "You spoke to the king today," Isolda said. "He spoke to me," Serafina said. I responded. "You looked at him directly." There was something careful in her voice, something that Serafina had learned to recognize as a warning dressed in neutral clothing. "You have a habit of that. I find it easier to have a conversation when I can see the person I am speaking with." Isolda moved to stand beside her, also looking out at the courtyard, also ostensibly admiring the stars. They stood side by side, and neither of them looked at the other, and Serafina was very aware of the careful construction of the moment. "The king does not form attachments," Isolda said. "He is not built for them. He has ruled this kingdom for over a century, and in that time he has maintained precisely the clarity of focus that ruling this land requires. Anyone who introduces disruption into that equilibrium does not find their time here pleasant." "Are you warning me?" Serafina said. "I am informing you," Isolda said pleasantly, "of how things are." Serafina turned to look at her then, and Isolda's golden eyes met hers without blinking. They stood in the starlit courtyard of the northern keep and looked at each other, and Serafina understood several things simultaneously. She understood that Isolda was afraid of something, though she hid it under layers of authority and elegance so well that most people would never have seen through them. She understood that the fear was specifically about her, about Serafina, about something Isolda believed she represented. She understood that whatever Isolda was protecting, she had been protecting it for a long time, and she was very good at it. "Thank you for the information," Serafina said evenly. She turned back to the stars. After a moment, she heard Isolda's footsteps retreat across the courtyard stones, and she was alone again with the cold and the clarity of the northern sky, and the marks on her wrists were warm, and she no longer pretended not to notice. She began, in the days that followed, to learn the keep. Not through any deliberate exploration, she heeded the instruction not to wander, or at least she heeded it in its most technical interpretation, staying within the areas she had legitimate reason to be in, which turned out to be more of the keep than she had initially expected, because healers had legitimate reason to be in most places. She learned the rhythms of the household, who woke early and who stayed up late, which guards had chronic joint pain from old injuries, and which ones had breathing issues they had never mentioned to Aldrin, which servants were lonely and which were happy, and which were afraid, and which were simply tired. She learned these things because she paid attention to people, because she had always been better at reading others than at being read herself, and because information had always been one of the few things available to her in abundance. She learned about the solstice ceremony from a young guard named Peter, who had a recurring shoulder issue she treated twice a week, and who, in the grateful way of someone whose pain has been competently addressed, tended to talk to her more than he probably should have. The ceremony of the ice solstice, he told her, was the most sacred ritual of the Northern Kingdom, held every 50 years. In it, the Alpha King was required to present a mate before the assembled packs, to formally choose and claim a queen, who would stand beside him as co-ruler. The ritual was ancient and binding. If the king did not choose, the treaty structure that held the northern territories together would be considered destabilized, and the allied pacts would have cause to dissolve their agreements. "It is in 3 weeks," Peter told her, wincing slightly as she worked on the tight muscles around his shoulder blade. "The Matilhas have been sending their candidates for months. Lady Isolda has been coordinating the preparations." "Lady Isolda," Serafina said, keeping her voice neutral. "She has been the king's chief counselor for 40 years, Peter said. Some say she expects to be his choice. She has positioned herself very carefully over the decades." He paused. "Forgive me. I should not speak of it." "I did not hear anything," Serafina said, which was technically true in the sense that she had no intention of repeating any of it. She thought about what Peter had told her as she cleaned her instruments afterward. She thought about Isolda's careful warnings, about the golden eyes in the starlit courtyard, about the fear she had sensed beneath the elegance. She thought about the ceremony and what it meant. A king who had ruled alone for over a century, making a public choice, binding himself by ritual to someone who would stand beside him before all the allied pacts. She thought about duty and politics, and the things people did, because structure required them, and not because their hearts led them there. She was not thinking about the king. She told herself she was not thinking about the king. She was very good at telling herself things. She met him again in the library 3 days later. She had gone. There, after the evening meal, because Aldrin had mentioned a specific text on northern plant compounds that might clarify a question she had about the meadow sweet formula, and the library was technically within her legitimate range of movement, because Aldrin had sent her there once before for a reference volume. The library of the Northern Keep was extraordinary. 3 levels of carved stone shelves, reaching toward a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations, and she had paused just inside the door to take it in before she heard movement from the upper level and looked up to find Caspian Dravek sitting at a reading table on the second gallery. A book open before him, looking down at her. "The healer," he said, and even from that height his voice carried with no effort. "Your Majesty," she said. "I apologize for the intrusion. Aldrin sent me for a reference text." "You do not need to apologize for using the library," he said. "It is a library." He paused. "Come up." She climbed the narrow stone stairs to the upper gallery and found a space that felt different from the public areas of the keep, more lived in, more personal. There were candles burning in multiple holders, giving the space a warm light that the lower levels lacked. Several books were open on the table, not displayed but genuinely in use, bristling with small paper markers, covered in careful marginal notations in a hand she would later recognize as his own. He had a cup of something steaming beside him that smelled like black tea and something more complex beneath it. Something she could not identify but that her healer's instincts noted as interesting. "What text are you looking for?" he said, returning his eyes to the book before him. She told him the title. He pointed without looking up toward the south wall of the gallery, 3rd shelf from the right, and she found it exactly where he indicated. She stood with it in her hands and debated whether to leave immediately, which would be appropriate, and sensible, or to stay, which would be neither appropriate nor sensible, but which her curiosity was strongly advocating for. She stayed. She sat in the chair on the opposite side of the reading table, far enough away to be clearly respectful of the distance, and she opened the text and began to read. For a while there was no sound, but the turning of pages and the distant sound of wind against the high windows, and the warmth of the candles, and the small sounds of 2 people occupying the same space in a companionable silence that neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them addressed. "You are not afraid of me," he said eventually. He did not look up from his book. "No," she said honestly. "Everyone is afraid of me." "I know," she said. "I noticed." He looked up then. The candlelight caught his eyes and made them less gray, warmer, the color of the sky just after sunrise when the cloud cover was thin. He studied her with that thorough, unhurried attention that she was beginning. To understand was simply how he engaged with anything that he considered worth understanding. "Why not?" he said. She considered the question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. "I have been afraid of many things in my life," she said. "People who did not see me. People who saw me but decided I was less than I was. Situations I could not control. Places where my value was determined by others and always found to be less than I felt it to be. You are powerful, and you are ancient, and you are very clearly capable of significant harm." She paused. "But you have not looked at me as if I am less than I am. That is rarer than terror, in my experience, and I find I respond to it better." The silence that followed was long enough that she began to wonder if she had said too much, revealed too much, been too direct in the way she was sometimes too direct and which had never quite served her socially. Then he said very quietly, "What are you?" and the question did not have the shape of an insult. It had the shape of genuine bewilderment, of a man who had been certain of something and found himself uncertain, which she suspected was not a feeling he had frequently. The marks on her wrists were burning now, warm as pressed palms, and she felt the familiar urge to cover them, and the equally familiar knowledge that covering them accomplished nothing, because whatever they were doing it whether or not anyone could see them. She set her book down on the table and looked at him steadily. "I do not know," she said. "I have never known. I have spent 24 years being something I cannot name in a world where not knowing what you are is considered a failure of self-knowledge." She held his gaze. "What do you see?" He looked at her for a long time. "I see someone who should not exist," he said at last. And before she could decide how to respond to that, he rose from his chair and left the library, and she sat alone among the candles with her book unread, in her lap, and the marks on her wrists burning like small suns. She went to Aldrin the next morning and asked him, as casually as she could manage, about old blood lichen physiological markers. Specifically, she asked about ancient bloodlines that were believed to be extinct or lost. He looked at her over his teacup, with the eyes of someone who understood exactly what she was actually asking, and had been waiting, with some patience, for her to get around to asking it. "The vein blood," he said. Simply. She had heard the name. Everyone in the supernatural world had heard the name, in the same way you heard the names of things that were mythological, referenced in stories and histories, but no longer extant in the world. The vein were the oldest lichen bloodline, predating the pack structure as it currently existed, predating most of the rituals and hierarchies that the wolf world had built up over the past 5 centuries. They were supposed to have ended 300 years ago in a series of wars that had wiped out the last of them. They were supposed to be gone. The vein line had specific markers, Aldrin said carefully. Physical markers, present from birth, regardless of whether the blood had been activated. He looked at her wrists, pointedly, and then back at her face. Silver tracings in the skin. A connection to cold environments that manifested as comfort rather than threat. An instinctive authority over other wolves that did not require pack bonds or dominance. Displays. He set his cup down. An ancient lichen in possession of vein heritage would know it immediately upon encountering a carrier, even a dormant one. "Even after 300 years, she said. "Blood knows blood," he said. "Especially blood that old." He paused. "The Voss pack kept records, I believe, of their ancestral history. Thorough ones." She thought about the elders who had sent her here. She thought about the care with which they had chosen her specifically. A junior healer when a senior one was requested, a young woman when experience would have served better, someone they could afford to give away because she was not precious to them. She had always thought it was because she was not precious. She was beginning to understand it might have been because she was too precious, in a way they did not want to keep in their own house, and far too dangerous to hold. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and let herself feel the full weight of the possibility that Aldrin had just handed her, and it was considerable. It was almost too large to hold in her mind all at once. If she carried vein blood, even dormant, even diluted over generations, then everything she had always been told she was: a junior healer, a minor member of a minor pack, a daughter of a family that had been important once but had faded. All of it was not wrong exactly, but it was profoundly incomplete. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and felt the marks on her wrists pulse. Steadily, and she breathed. The question was not what she was. She was beginning to understand what she was. The question was what she was going to do about it. The following week was spent in a careful, deliberate performance of normalcy that cost her more than she allowed anyone to see. She worked with Aldrin. She treated Peter's shoulder. She cataloged and compounded and learned the peculiarities of old blood lichen physiology with a thoroughness that Aldrin noted with quiet approval. She avoided Isolda when she could, and was courteously impenetrable when she could not. She did not return to the library in the evening. She did not seek out the king, and she told herself that this was appropriate, that it was the correct choice, that she was a healer serving in a foreign court, and she had no business seeking out anyone, let alone the king, let alone this particular king, who looked at her as if she was a question he could not stop trying to answer. He sought her out instead. He appeared in the east corridor on a Tuesday afternoon, not by accident as the first time, not by the coincidence of the library, but clearly, and with evident purpose, and he fell into step beside her as she moved toward the storage chambers, with her arms full of dried herbs, and said without preamble, "Walk with me." She walked with him. They moved through corridors she had not been in, wider ones, better lit, where the tapestries gave way to carved stone reliefs depicting the history of the Northern Kingdom in elaborate detail. He did not make conversation. He walked with the same quality of presence she had noticed from the beginning, the sense of someone who took up exactly as much space as they required, and not a fraction more. And she matched her pace to his and let the silence exist, and she found, as she had found in the library, that silence with him was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, one of the more comfortable silences she had experienced, which said something she was not quite ready to say out loud. They came to a door she had not seen before, smaller than the main doors of the keep, set into the stone at the end of a corridor that seemed to dead end there. He opened it, and outside was cold air, and a narrow stone walkway along the outer wall of the keep, and beyond it the mountains, and beyond them the enormous pale sky, and snow on every surface, immaculate and undisturbed. And the view was extraordinary, the kind of view that made you understand without being told why someone would build a keep here, on this spot, facing exactly this direction. She stood at the wall and looked out at the mountains, and felt the cold on her face, and breathed it in. And beside her, Caspian stood and did the same. And they stood there for a long time without saying anything. "My father built this keep," he said eventually. "He stood on this wall the first morning after it was completed, and said that a man who could rule with this view at his back could rule anything." He paused. He was not wrong. He was also not as right as he believed. "What do you mean?" she said. "He thought the view would give him perspective," Caspian said. "He thought that if you could see far enough you would always know what was coming." He was quiet for a moment, and she waited, because she had the sense that this was someone who rarely spoke about his father, and should not be interrupted. He did not account for the things that arrive from very close by. The things you do not see because you are looking at the horizon. She looked at him, instead of the mountains. The cold wind moved his dark hair, and he looked out at the peaks with an expression she was finally learning to read, or at least to identify, not the absence of feeling that she had initially thought it, but the careful, disciplined management of it. The composure of someone who had lived long enough to understand that emotion unchecked in someone with his power and his history could do considerable damage, and who had developed extraordinary internal architecture to prevent that from happening. She saw the architecture now, and she saw, behind it, the person it protected. "You do not speak of your father often," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you think of him." "He has been dead for 90 years, he said. "I think of him less than I did. I think of the things he taught me more than him." He paused. "You ask me what I see when I look at you." She had not reminded him of that. She had not mentioned it since the library. She waited. "I see someone who carries something ancient," he said. "Something that has not been in this world for 3 centuries. Something that I did not believe I would encounter again." He looked at her then, and his pale eyes were very direct, and she held them without looking away. "I see someone who makes my blood recognize something it has not recognized in a very long time." The marks on her wrists were not merely warm now. They were bright. She could feel them, a steady, radiant heat under her sleeves, and she knew from the way his gaze moved briefly and with clear awareness to her wrists that he felt it too, that he had felt it since she walked into the great hall, that the breath she had heard him release as she was leaving had been this, the recognition of something he had not expected to find. "The vein blood," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "Aldrin told me," she said, "what I might be." "What you are," he said, with the certainty of someone who has no question about it. "Not might. Are." She stood on the cold walkway with the mountains in front of her and the king beside her, and thought about the weight of being something she had not known she was. Something that 3 centuries of history had shaped into significance she was only beginning to understand. She thought about her pack, about the elders who had known, who had sent her here deliberately, sending her like a piece in a game she had not known she was playing. She thought about what it meant that the most powerful Lycan king in the Northern Territories had looked at her from a throne and exhaled like a man confronting something he had given up expecting. "The solstice ceremony," she said. "Yes," he said. "You knew," she said. "When I arrived, you knew what I was." "I knew what you might be," he said, which was the first time she had heard him offer a distinction between might and certainty, which told her something. The blood had to confirm it. Ancient blood does not announce itself. It reveals itself gradually, in proximity, in response. "Response to what?" she asked, and she asked it knowing, or at least suspecting, what the answer would be. "To its match," he said simply. She breathed in the cold air, and out again, and stood with the weight of that. In the werewolf world, the concept of the mate bond, of fated pairing, of the deep recognition between 2 wolves whose natures were genuinely complementary, was considered the highest and rarest form of connection. She had heard of it. She had believed in it abstractly, in the way you believed in things that happened to other people in stories. She had never believed it would happen to her. She had not believed she was the kind of person things like that happened to, which she now understood was not actually a rational belief, but the residue of being told for 24 years that she was a junior healer of middling worth. "This is complicated," she said. "Profoundly," he agreed. "The ceremony," she said. "The candidates, Isolda." "Yes," he said. "What do you intend to do?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "I intend," he said carefully, "to be honest about what I have found. I intend to fulfill my duty to this kingdom, which means standing in the solstice ceremony and making a choice that my conscience and my blood can both sustain." He paused. "Beyond that, I am not in the habit of announcing my intentions before I have implemented them." She almost smiled. She stopped herself, but the effort was visible, and she saw his eyes track it, and something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite a smile, but was clearly a response to the almost smile, a warmth that moved through the careful architecture of his composure like light through stone. She turned back to the mountains. "You should know," she said, "that I will not be managed. I will not be moved into position or leveraged or used as a piece in anyone's game. Not the Voss elders and not anyone else." She said it quietly, without heat, as statement of fact. "Whatever I am, whatever my blood means, I am also myself. Serafina Voss, a healer, a woman who makes her own choices." She looked at him. "I thought you should know that before anything else." The silence stretched long enough that she could hear the wind in the mountain peaks, a low, constant sound like the world breathing. Then he said, and his voice was different, carrying something she had not heard in it before, something almost soft. "I would not want you any other way. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on." Isolda came to her room that night. Serafina was not asleep, had not expected to be, had been sitting at her desk watching the candle burn and thinking with the focused attention she brought to complex problems, and the knock at her door, while late, did not surprise her particularly. She opened it and found Isolda in the corridor, not dressed for public appearance as she always was during the day, but in a dark robe, her hair down. And in this state she looked more real, and also, Serafina thought, more dangerous. The performance of authority, set aside, revealed something sharper underneath. "May I come in?" Isolda said. It was, technically, a request. The phrasing was courteous. The eyes were not. Serafina stepped back and let her in. She did not offer tea. She stood near the window and Isolda stood near the door, and they looked at each other in the candlelight. "I know what you are," Isolda said. "I suspected as much," Serafina said. "I have been watching for something like you for 40 years, Isolda said. "Every pack transfer, every diplomatic exchange, every young wolf who came through this keep for any reason. Watching for the vein mark, watching for the signs." Something moved through her golden eyes, something complex and old and not entirely cruel. "Do you know what it is to watch for? Something for 40 years and have it arrive exactly when you cannot afford it." Serafina said nothing. She waited. "I have given this court everything," Isolda said. 40 years of service, 40 years of managing his councils, his alliances, his treaties, the impossible political architecture of 30 allied pacts who all believe their interests should be primary. 40 years of making this kingdom function in the spaces he does not have patience for. She paused. "I did not do it for love, though I will not pretend love has never been part of it. I did it because I am good at it, because this kingdom requires it, because without people who do the unglamorous work of governance, the powerful men who stand on cold walkways looking at mountains would have nothing to stand on." Her voice was steady, but her hands, Serafina noticed, were not entirely still. "That work has value," Serafina said carefully. "Real value. No one who understood anything would dismiss it. He would not." "Dismiss it," Isolda said. "He never has. He has always valued what I bring to this court. But value is not the same as what the solstice ceremony requires." She stopped. She looked at Serafina with something that was close to asking. "I need you to understand what you are walking into, what your blood is walking into. The ceremony is not simply romantic. It is political in ways that have consequences for 30 packs and thousands of wolves. A vein-blooded mate for the Glacier King would shift the balance of power in ways that would not be comfortable for everyone." "I know," Serafina said. "I have been thinking about nothing else." Isolda looked at her sharply. And I am not walking into anything," Serafina said. "Nothing has been decided. Nothing will be decided by me alone, or by him alone, or by the accident of old blood recognizing old blood." She looked at Isolda steadily. "You have spent 40 years building something real in this court. I have spent 24 years being told I was not worth much and discovering that was wrong. I think we probably have more in common than you expect." The silence in the small room was different from the silence of the great hall, or the library, or the walkway. This one had texture. Isolda looked at her for a long time, and Serafina watched her work through something, some internal calculation or recalibration, and she waited with patience, because patience was something she had in genuine supply. "I will not help you," Isolda said finally. "Do not expect that." "I do not," Serafina said. "But I will not work against you," she said. And the words seemed to cost her something. "If you are what the blood says you are, then working against you would be working against the kingdom. And I have never done that, regardless of my personal interests." She moved toward the door. "The ceremony is in 11 days. You will need to be prepared." "For what?" Serafina said. "I am not a candidate." Isolda looked at her from the doorway with the golden eyes of someone who had always been very far ahead of the present moment. "You will be," she said, and she left. Serafina stood in her room after the door closed and let the candlelight move over the walls and breathed. She pressed her wrists together in front of her and felt the warmth of the marks, steady and insistent and increasingly difficult to pretend was not real. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something more complicated than afraid, something that was fear and anticipation braided together, the particular feeling of standing at the edge of a change so large you cannot yet see its shape. She went to the window. The courtyard below was empty, and the stars above were extraordinary, and the snow on the frozen fountain caught the light and held it. She pressed her palm to the glass and felt the cold, clear and real and familiar, the cold that had never bothered her, the cold that was, she now understood, something like home. 2 days before the solstice ceremony, she was formally presented as a candidate. She was not consulted. Aldrin came to the healing room in the morning with the expression of a man delivering information he had not decided how to frame, and told her that the king had directed that her name be added to the ceremony register. She stood very still and received this information, and Aldrin watched her process it and said, "You do not have to accept." "No," she said. "I suppose I do not." "The king will not compel you," Aldrin said. "Whatever the blood says, he is not that kind of man." "I know," she said. She did know. She had spent enough time learning to read him to know that clearly, precisely, without doubt. He would not compel her. He would make his position known, as he had on the walkway, with the careful honesty of someone who was constitutionally unable to dissemble. And then he would wait, as she had told him she needed things to wait, until she made her own choice. She thought about the Voss elders, and what they had intended when they sent her here. She thought about 40 years of Isolda's work and the strange, honest conversation in her small room. She thought about Pater's shoulder and the 30 allied packs, and the impossibility of governance, and the cold walkway and the mountains. She thought about the marks on her wrists and the 300 years of vain blood waiting, apparently, for exactly this. And she thought about the fact that none of this, not one part of it, had been her choice until right now. She told Aldrin she accepted. She was not prepared for what accepting meant in practical terms. Within hours, the women responsible for ceremony preparations appeared in her room with fabrics and implements, and a purposeful efficiency that left her no role but to stand very still and be transformed into what they required her to be. She was bathed in water infused with northern herbs that smelled like winter itself. Her hair, which she had always worn simply because simple was easy, and she had never had reason for more, was dressed in a complicated arrangement with small silver pins that caught light when she moved. She was given a gown in the deep blue-white of glacial ice, so pale it was almost colorless, and it fit her as if it had been made for her, which she suspected it had been, which raised questions she did not have time to ask. She looked at herself in the mirror when they were finished, and saw, with a strange detachment, someone she barely recognized. Not because she looked different in the ways she had expected to look different, the elaborate hair, the formal gown, because she looked like someone who had arrived, finally, at the thing she had always been becoming, the destination that the marks on her wrists had been pointing toward since the day she was born. She looked, she thought, like someone who knew what she was. The ceremony chamber was at the center of the keep, a vast circular room with walls of pale stone and a ceiling open to the sky through a shaft cut through the rock above, and through that shaft fell the thin silver light of the winter solstice. The longest night, the moon full and the stars gathered, and the light landing in a perfect circle on the floor below where the king would stand. The chamber was filled with wolves. Every allied pack had sent representatives, dozens of them, perhaps 100 people, filling the tiered stone seats that circled the central floor, and the noise of them, the collective breath and movement, and the undertone of contained energy that large numbers of supernatural beings generated was considerable. The candidates were 7. Serafina knew some of them by face, if not name. Women she had seen in the corridors over the past weeks, daughters of allied pack alphas, presented with care and obvious political intention. Beautiful and well-prepared, and clearly coached in the expectations of the ceremony. They stood in a line at the chamber's edge and waited. And Serafina stood at one end of the line and felt the marks on her wrists burning so brightly now that she was surprised no one had mentioned them. One of the other candidates, a tall woman with copper hair and the commanding bearing of an alpha's firstborn, leaned toward her and said quietly, "You are the healer." "Yes," Serafina said. "They say you carry old blood," the woman said. She did not sound hostile, merely curious. "They are correct," Serafina said. The copper-haired woman studied her for a moment. "Then this was never really a competition," she said, and she sounded remarkably more relieved than disappointed. The horns sounded. The assembled packs rose as one. Caspian Dravek entered the ceremony chamber from the north door, and Serafina watched him cross the floor toward the circle of moonlight, and she thought about a man who had not bowed in a century, who had ruled this cold kingdom with absolute authority and absolute loneliness for longer than she had been alive, who had built architecture around his composure to protect everyone in his vicinity from the weight of what he contained. She thought about the breath she had heard him release as she walked away from the throne on her first day, and she thought about the walkway and the mountains and the candles in the library. She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who had the capacity to see everything and had chosen, specifically and without pretense, to see her. He stood in the circle of moonlight and looked at the line of candidates, and his pale gray eyes moved along the line and then found her, and stopped. The chamber was very quiet. The ceremony master, an elderly wolf in formal robes, began the ritual words, the ancient phrasing of the solstice claiming that had been spoken the same way for 500 years. He spoke about the bond of pack and king, about the choice that would determine the stability of alliances, about the weight of the decision before the assembled packs. He spoke for several minutes and the chamber was absolutely silent, and Caspian Dravek did not look away from Serafina. She looked back. She had always looked back. She did not know how to stop. The ceremony master finished the formal preamble and turned to the king and said, in the ancient form, "Who does the king choose?" What happened next, Serafina understood later, was not supposed to happen. What was supposed to happen was that the king would step forward and cross the floor to the candidate of his choice and extend his hand, and she would take it, and they would stand together in the circle of moonlight, while the ceremony master bound the claiming with the ritual words, and the packs would witness, and it would be done. That was what was supposed to happen. What actually happened was that Caspian Dravek, the beast of the frozen north, the glacier king, the man who had not bowed in over a century, crossed the floor of the ceremony chamber and stopped before Serafina and went to one knee. The sound that went through the chamber was not quite a gasp and not quite a silence. It was the sound of 100 wolves simultaneously recalibrating everything they had believed about the order of the world. Even the ceremony master stopped speaking. Even Isolda, standing to one side of the chamber in her formal role as court counselor, went utterly still. Serafina looked down at him and felt the marks on her wrists blaze with a heat that was almost unbearable in its beauty, a warmth that spread from her wrists up her arms and through her chest and into everything. And she understood what was happening was not merely the ceremony, not merely the ritual, not merely the politics of 30 allied packs and the stability of a northern kingdom. What was happening was older than any of that. What was happening was the blood recognizing itself after 300 years. He looked up at her from one knee, and his pale gray eyes were no longer controlled, no longer managed, no longer the composure of a man who had learned to keep everything behind careful architecture. They were simply honest. They were simply him. "I see you, Serafina Voss," he said. His voice was quiet enough that it should not have carried in the large chamber, but it did carry perfectly, as his voice always did. "I see what you are. I see who you are. I see that they are not the same thing as each other, and that both of them matter." He paused. "I have ruled this kingdom for over a century. I have done it alone, because I believed that was what it required. I have held everything at the distance that my authority seemed to demand. I have been very cold for a very long time, and I did not know until you walked into my great hall with your chin level and your eyes on mine that I had been waiting for someone who was not afraid of that." He was still looking at her, steadily, with the directness she had recognized on the first day as something she understood at a bone-deep level. "You told me you would not be managed or leveraged or placed as a piece in someone else's game. I am not asking you to be. I am asking you, in front of everyone you might need to witness it, to be exactly what you are, beside me, in this kingdom, as my equal in every sense that the word is capable of holding." The chamber was absolutely still. The moonlight fell through the shaft in the ceiling and landed in its silver circle around them both, which was not the way the moonlight was supposed to work during the ceremony, which was supposed to illuminate only the king, alone in the center of the floor, which was not where he was standing. The moonlight had moved, or rather it seemed as if it had expanded, as if the ancient ritual that shaped the ceremony had recognized something in this moment and adjusted accordingly. Serafina breathed. She breathed in the cold air of the chamber, and the mineral-clean smell of the ancient stone and the winter air coming through the shaft. Above, and she felt the marks on her wrists burning with a completeness that she had never felt before. Not the half-warm pulsing of proximity or recognition, but something total. Something that felt like the resolution of a chord that had been suspended for 300 years, waiting for this specific note to complete it. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, and the warmth that moved through the contact was extraordinary. Not the supernatural heat of the marks alone, but something else, something that felt almost shockingly ordinary, the warmth of a person choosing another person in full awareness of what they were, and what it would cost, and what it would mean. "Stand up," she said quietly. "I cannot have a conversation with you down there." Something moved across his face that was, unmistakably, a smile. Small and contained and clearly out of practice, but real. He stood. He was considerably taller than her, and he stood very close, and the moonlight was around them both, and the chamber was still absolutely silent. "Yes," she said, "for everyone in the chamber to hear. Yes, I accept." The sound that went through the room then was nothing like the stunned quiet of moments before. It was the sound of 100 wolves releasing something they had been holding, something between relief and wonder and the particular awe that comes from witnessing something genuinely rare. It rose through the chamber and up through the shaft in the ceiling into the night sky. And Serafina thought, distantly and with something that might have been joy, that if you were standing outside in the cold right now and you heard that sound, you would know something had happened that had not happened before and would not happen again. The ceremony master recovered himself and began to speak the binding words, and they stood in the moonlight while he spoke, and Caspian Dravik held her hand with the grip of someone who had decided, absolutely and without reservation. And she held his back with the same quality of decision, and the marks on her wrists were no longer burning. They were simply warm, the warmth of something that had arrived where it was supposed to be. Isolda stood to the side of the chamber and watched, and her expression, for once, was not managing anything. She was simply looking, with the face of someone who had spent 40 years building something and was, finally, seeing it become something she had not anticipated and could not have. Planned and was, in the deepest and most honest part of herself, glad to witness. In the weeks that followed, the Northern Kingdom changed in ways both visible and subtle. Serafina moved from the healer's quarters to the rooms adjacent to the king's chambers, which were large and warm, and had a window that looked at the mountains. And she brought her herb satchel and her reference texts and her careful attention to detail. And she began, with a thoroughness that Aldrin watched with evident satisfaction, to understand the full scope of what it meant to be part of this court. She continued to work in the healing room because she had never intended to stop, and because the king had not asked her to, and because Aldrin needed her, and because the work was real work that mattered in ways that court ceremony was never going to replace. She added to it the other work, the learning of governance and alliance management, and the long, complex history of 30 packs and their intersecting interests, and she learned it with the same focused attention she had brought to the Meadowsweet formula, looking for the patterns, finding the substitutions that made things work better than they had before. Caspian watched her do this with an expression that she was now fully capable of reading, and that was, she thought, one of the better things she had seen on anyone's face. It was the expression of someone who had expected to continue as they had been and found, instead, that continuation was no longer the most interesting option available. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not become one. But he appeared in the healing room on the afternoons she worked late, sometimes with tea, sometimes with a question about something she had mentioned, once with a problem from one of the pack councils that he wanted to think through aloud, and she learned to recognize these appearances for what they were. He was not checking on her. He was choosing to be where she was. He was, in his particular ancient and controlled and ultimately very honest way, present. The vein blood continued to wake. She felt it happening, not dramatically, not in a single overwhelming transformation, but gradually. The way winter gives way to spring, not in one moment, but in the accumulated small decisions of temperature over weeks, a degree here, a degree there, and then one morning you walk outside, and something is different. She felt her connection to the pack wolves of the northern kingdom deepen and clarify. She felt her senses sharpen in ways she had always had, but that now operated at a different register, like the difference between hearing and truly listening. She felt the cold settle into her, not as something she endured, or even merely did not mind, but as something she belonged to, something that was hers in the way that a language is yours when it is the first one you ever dreamed in. The vein blood, it turned out, had not simply been waiting for the right mate. Bond to activate. It had been waiting for the right context, the right home, the right cold landscape that matched something in its deepest structure. She stood on the walkway on a morning 3 weeks after the solstice ceremony, the mountains in front of her and Caspian beside her, and she felt the full weight of what she was settle into her bones like water finding its level, and she breathed. "You are different," he said. He was looking at her profile. "Yes," she agreed. "Better," he said. And then, because he was constitutionally honest, and she had asked him to be, he said, "Though I did not think that was possible." She looked at him then, and he was looking at her with the face he only had in private, the one without the architecture, the one that was simply Caspian, and she thought about the fool she would have had to be to not see it now, after everything. She thought about her 24 years of being told what she was worth, and finding out the assessment had been profoundly incomplete. She thought about cold corridors and library candles, and a man going to one knee in a moonlit chamber while 100 wolves held their breath. She thought about all of it, and she smiled. "What do you think will happen next?" she asked him. She meant it as a small joke, a gesture toward the impossibility of prediction that had characterized everything about the past weeks. He looked at her with those pale gray eyes that she had spent months learning to read, and he said, with the quiet certainty of someone speaking not prediction, but intention, "Something extraordinary." She believed him. She pressed her palm to his where their hands rested on the cold stone of the wall, and the marks on her wrists were warm and steady, and the mountains were enormous and beautiful in the morning light, and the cold was home, and she was for the first time in 24 years, exactly where she was supposed to be. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?